What's good, everyone? This is Bizcoon back at you with another reaction to Metatron, The Origins of the Greeks, a deep dive into Hellenic ethnogenesis. For those that don't know, I'm pretty sure plenty of you should know who the Greeks are. And if you don't know who the Greeks are, then I don't know what they've been teaching you in school. But one thing I do know about the Greeks and their origins is that the Greeks are an Indo-European speaking people. For those that don't know, Indo-European refers to a language family that spans Europe all the way to India and includes a wide variety of languages from English, German, Spanish, Italian, Greek, obviously, Russian, Persian, Sanskrit even. All of that kind of deserves a whole video dedicated to itself. But for now, right now, I just want to get right into the video. The main reason I'm making this video is I had mentioned in some previous videos that I'm working on much bigger video than something like this, but I am waiting for my 3D model to be finished first, and it's taken a little longer than it was supposed to due to the fact that I was given a preview of the model and we needed to make some changes to it beforehand. Hopefully it should be done either this week or the next. It was supposed to be done last week, but I needed to make some changes to it first. But either way, before we get started, make sure you guys watch Metatron's original video, and then be sure to come back to this video, leave a like and subscribe, since these reaction videos don't seem to do very well in terms of views. Some of these other videos I've made have been doing very well, which is one of the types of videos that I've been wanting to make, but I'm going to wait until my 3D model is done. But for now, let's go ahead and get started with the deep dive into the origins of the Greeks. And then chaos was born, and then wide-breasted earth, the steady firmament of all the immortals who hold the peak of snowy Olympus, and murky Tartarus in the innermost part of the broad earth, and limb-loosening Eros, who is most beautiful among the immortal gods, who overpowers the mind and rational counsel in the heart. Hesiod's Theogony.
Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and whenever we think of the Greeks, we think of a single, united, homogeneous people, interconnected by culture, language, and history, inhabiting the current state of Greece, or Elada. And yet, one of the most archetypal notions of ancient Greece is that of the polis, the independent city-states. This may appear as a paradox of sorts, where the ancient Greeks are single unified people, or were they a collection of people marked by the perimeters of their city-state.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it worked in, like, ancient Greece in particular. Well, at least in the context of the classical period around the first millennium BC. So, all of the people within these city-states, they all kind of referred to themselves as collectively Greek or Hellenic. They all, like, spoke like different dialects of the same Greek language, and they all participated in the Olympics, but they more closely aligned with whatever city or city-state that they were born in. Like, the people of Athens consider themselves to be Athenians, and Sparta consider themselves to be Spartans. Those of Macedon, Macedonian, but yeah, we don't, like today, it's obviously a modern nation state, but back then, they were multiple different city-states.
A key factor we have to disclose earlier on in this analysis is that while being separate and independent, and lacking the concept of a single Greek nation in the modern sense, the ancient Greeks did consider themselves as one when faced by a common enemy.
Yeah, this is what happened when it comes to the Persians. I'm sure we all know the famous movie 300 and the late epic meme of this being Sparta. But regardless, it was only really when the Persians wanted to basically take over Greece did they truly unify and identify themselves as quintessentially Hellenic Greek.
As we will see already in the Archaic period, an emerging phenomenon of internal relationships appears to have been the true beginning of a synthesis of ethnic and cultural strata. But when did this concept of single Greek identity begin? What was there before? And how did this primal form of collective societal boundary come to be?
Let's go. First, the ethnogenesis. Let's see where we're going on with this.
Aristotle understood the poleis in two ways. One, as specific communities, say for instance Corinth, Athens, Sparta. Two, as a physical location, a city in its structural presence of a human settled community.
Right, each of these city-states, I know we think of them as just the city themselves, but there's a reason they're called city-states. I mean, a state, by definition, is an organized political entity that has like a capital and well-defined borders. So it's more than just their respective cities. It also includes the land that surrounds the city, and the city or the land belongs to that city.
The second usage in this dual definition is often ignored in modern discourse, while being absolutely present in the ancient texts. Moreover, understanding the spatial dynamics between the genesis of a people's identity and the way they view themselves and the world around them is paramount to unlocking the method of our concept of a people is born. Connect that with the mythic genealogies, and we have the building blocks of our comprehensive analysis. Efforts to
Right, many different ancient cultures around the world all had these like ancient like kings lists and genealogies. I know that the biblical genealogies are one of the more well-known, you know, going from like Adam to Noah to Abraham and all that. But the Greeks and the Romans and various other cultures also had those types of genealogies as well, usually as an extension of the concept of the cult of the ancestor, which this one friend of mine says was mostly a Chinese thing, even though it's not exclusive to China. Many cultures around the world had cults of the ancestors.
define ethnicity frequently rely on the identification of specific criteria believed to constitute an ethnic group. In 1986, Anthony D. Smith proposed a framework comprising 6 such components: a collective designation, a shared historical memory, a distinct cultural repertoire, a sense of group solidarity, and connection to a defined territory, and a common myth of ancestral origin. Building upon this foundation, Jonathan N. Hall argued that territorial association, particularly when coupled with a methodologized genealogy, forms the core of ethnic identity. In contrast, Eric Gruen critiques the entire framework of ethnic criteria. Gruen contends that by refraining from hierarchizing these criteria, Smith sidesteps critical debates regarding which attributes are most essential, and whether these features reflect historical realities or merely serve the ideological aim of national discourse.
Yeah, like, I mean, we all know, like, the story of Romulus and Remus. They were both... I don't remember the exact circumstances of their birth, but we know, at least according to the Roman tradition, their father was Mars, who was the patron deity of Rome itself, who was analog to Greek Ares, right? And then they were raised by the she-wolf, and then they grew up in and around where, like, Rome would eventually be established by Romulus himself in the context of fratricide. But even Roman historians, much later in history, around when the Republic sprung up, well into the Empire, a lot of people questioned this origin story of Rome. So even people back then questioned their own people's origin stories.
Regardless of which position you take, it's essential to emphasize that the process of ethnogenesis is both somewhat natural and artificial. Members of an ethnic group do often possess some immutable characteristics, such as common phenotypic traits, some mutable characteristics, such as their core language, but do not always inherently possess fixed distinguishing traits at their genesis. Rather, these tend to gradually develop over time within highly cohesive communities. What this means is that there is a social component which interacts with the biological internal sphere of early tribal networks.
One of the things is that even if a certain people group are not necessarily related to their neighbors. They could have like a shared cultural identity or even a common language. I mean, this is something that happens a lot it happens all over the world. My first example is that of America. Here in the US, we have people of all sorts of races and ethnicities, but most of us all speak English, and we're all like American. And the fact that we have different ancestries doesn't really make us any more or less American than other people. And the same thing holds true with, like, in the UK. You'll have they all speak English, but they all have like separate identities from each other. You have Scots, Englishmen, Welsh, Irish, all of that. They're all, well, not necessarily the Northern Irish would be considered. They would all be considered British, but they're not all exactly the same like ethnicity. And so I think that's the point that he may have been trying to make. Like, when it comes to an identity of some kind, it doesn't always line up with like genetics or language. Oftentimes it's simply just a shared culture that makes them one and the same, even if there's a lot of variance.
Stage of our analysis, we can say that ethnic identity is often fluid in its primordial genesis, finally crystallizing through a highly dynamic process with multiple variables.
From palaces to sanctuaries.
Classical Greece emerged from the period known as the Greek Dark Ages, or the Hellenic Middle Ages, which spanned from 1100 BC to 750 BC.
This is the period of time between the end of the Bronze Age collapse, when the Trojan War was supposed to have taken place, to the beginning of the Iron Age, which was the period of time in which the Phoenicians started colonizing the Mediterranean, with one of their major innovations being their abjad, which became the predecessor of many modern European alphabets, not just that of Greek, but of Latin and Cyrillic, and obviously the various abjads of Semitic languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Arabic, and all that. There are some attempts to connect it to the Indian Brahmi script, but that's up for debate.
Following the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. This
Right,
pivotal historical event is often...
Yeah, this was the civilization that's often associated with the Trojan War, as we can see here. Like, we have records from the Hittites that mention a civilization known as Achiawa, which is most likely Greece, but it's a little vague in some aspects. Like, there are references to, like, certain kings that can be connected to certain figures within, like, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but we don't really have that much information on that.
Referred to as the fall of the Mycenaean palaces. As apparent by a careful analysis of available data-based structures, the decline of Mycenaean civilization occurred due to a variety of factors. An investigation of Linear B documents reveals that our current understanding of the societal collapse is riddled with questions and lacking in certainties.
By the way, you mentioned this Linear B. You're probably thinking, why is it called Linear B? Linear B is the writing system that the Mycenaeans used in order to transcribe the Mycenaean Greek language, which is the oldest form of Greek that we have on record. So old that it's one of the bases for the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, which is believed to be the ancestral language of all the Indo-European languages. So yeah, Mycenaean Greek, along with Hittite and Vedic Sanskrit, are the three primary sources for Proto-Indo-European's reconstruction. Now, going back to this, the reason why it's called Linear B is because there's a variation of this known as Linear A that's written in a language that has yet to be deciphered. You'll find a lot of those around the world. There are a lot of languages around the world that haven't really been deciphered. I mean, one of the most famous or infamous ones is the Indus Valley. And then there's also, like, the script on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, right? Yeah. And There's one called the Biblosyllabary, which is attributed to in Byblos in modern-day Lebanon. And then there's a series of scripts that existed on the island of Cyprus that also haven't been deciphered. And yeah, it's a whole rabbit hole that I don't want to get into right now.
However, one thing is clear. The Dorians were not northern invaders or foreigners to Mycenaean society. Instead, they were one of the many ethnic groups comprising its social fabric, alongside the Achaeans, the Minians, the Peraebi, the Ionians, the Cretans, and the Lacedaemonians, all of whom are attested in Linear B texts. What likely occurred was a vast domino effect that also affected the ancient Near East, even though modern historiography has tried to eliminate the notion of destabilizing invasions by
Oh yeah, this, apologies for my avatar being in the way, but this is like basically the Bronze Age collapse. Like we have the Mycenaeans, Egyptians, Hittites over here, and the so-called Sea Peoples, as mentioned in Egyptian records, featuring mass migrations of different people in and out of different places of ambiguous origins. And these mass migrations took place during the Bronze Age collapse, and who knows what really happened.
foreign people. Such movements and effects likely did occur, as referenced in Egyptian records concerning the Sea People. However, early historiography exaggerated the impact of these invasions, which had more social repercussions than military or political ones. With the collapse of Mycenaean society, the Greek Dark Ages began, and the various ethnic groups that had already been part of Mycenaean Greeks contributed to the emergence of new realities, those of classical Greece. And of course, as one possible example, we have the Phocis. Phocis is one region of Greece that underwent a phenomenon of ethnogenesis. During the Mycenaean period, there seem to have been no palatial centers there, and the local communities appear to have orbited around those in Boeotia. With the onset of the Greek Dark Ages, however, Phocian sanctuaries became important points of reference, even for Boeotians and Thessalian communities. And
so some of them never really forgot where they came from. Like, we know that within the Iliad and the Odyssey, they have quite accurate memories of what life was like during the Mycenaean Age, right down to the fact that they remembered using bronze weapons and having these elaborate palaces. So we know that, like, the Iliad and Odyssey has a lot of mythological aspects to it, but that doesn't mean that they aren't based in truth. You could say the same thing about literally any text that could be seen as mythological, religious, or sacred, or something like that. There's always some level of truth to them.
distinctive trait of the Greek Dark Ages is precisely the shift of communal focus from palaces to sanctuaries.
These little animations. Phocians and Thessalians.
So let's focus our attention to these ancient people, the Phocians and the Thessalians. In the famous catalogue of ships in the Iliad, the Phocians are mentioned as an ethnos, but this term should be understood in reference specifically to the inhabitants of Anopius and its immediate surrounding. The term Phocians also appears in the Shield of Heracles, an archaic poem attributed to Hesiod, dated between the 8th and the 6th century BC. In classical text, Phocis is mentioned chiefly in relation to a series of military episodes known as the Sacred Wars, which progressively led to the establishment of a true Phocian koinon, or league, centered around the sanctuary of Delphi. This was an independent entity, a military alliance with sacral overtones. Traditionally, the narrative structure includes 4 sacred wars, although it's unclear whether the first ever truly occurred, or whether it was a literary construct. The second war began when Sparta extended its control over part of central Greece. These were attempts to dominate the Delphic sanctuary, a narrative possibly fabricated by the Athenians. In the Mycenaean era, Thessalian society revolved around the palace at Dimini, but during the Greek Dark Ages, Thessaly appears drawn to the sanctuaries of Phocis. This is supported by the discovery of Thessalian fibulae, or brooches, at the Phocian sanctuaries of Chiampolis and Abae, objects identical to those found at the major Thessalian site of Therae. And within this, a crucial point is the following. Within Thessaly's social fabric, we also find the perioikic populations, neighboring people who, once defeated in battle, were incorporated into Thessalian society as subordinates. Their strict class structure resembled that of Sparta, and proper Thessalians resided in the tetrads, or 4 regional divisions. However, Thessaly was a polis perpetually inclined towards expansion, and according to Plutarch, at some point, prior to the Persian Wars, the Thessalians managed to assert control over Phocis.
I'm trying to think of something to add on in order to make this transformative, but I don't really know anything about the Phocians or the Thessalians, so I don't really have much to add on, but I want to make sure that I'm being transformative.
It is important to underline that the army also included units supplied by periodic communities, who were now part of their society. The movement of people, the military conquests, the stratification of society are all early constituents of the genesis of a national identity.
Alright, Hellenic consciousness. Okay, this, yeah, I can add on to this. The concept of a Greek identity wasn't really that much of a thing back then. Well, I'd already mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but yeah, it wasn't really until, like, the Achaemenid Persians came along and threatened to conquer them did they actually start being, like, quintessentially Greek. They were, like, all the city-states, Athens and Sparta and all these others were constantly fighting each other, vying for control. But when faced with an external threat, that's when they decided to set their differences aside in order to become one Greek identity. And that further accelerated under Alexander the Great, who was the first to truly unite Greece. And not only that, but conquer Persia. So, yeah.
Having visualized a few instances of how initially separate ethnos had begun to fuse into cohesive culture-driven population clusters as a generative process, we can now explore the societal roots of this phenomenon and shared criteria. The formative period of the archaic era witnessed the gradual crystallization of distinct civic identities among the emerging Greek city-states. It is during this epoch that the nascent foundations of what would later be recognized as Hellenic identity began to take shape. Initially autonomous in character, these city-states progressively engaged in intercommunal interaction, fostering socio-cultural affinities that laid the groundwork for an eventual collective ethnos. The fabrication of mythical genealogies during this period served dual functions. On one hand, they legitimized territorial claims by invoking descent from heroic ancestors. On the other, they manufactured a shared lineage that later generations of Greeks would retroactively embrace as evidence of ethnic cohesion. This process of identity construction was underpinned by common linguistic usage and the shared observance of religious practices, both of which played integral roles in daily life. These elements, language, cult, and lineage, came to serve as the primary indicia of Hellenic ethnicity. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing in the classical period, systematizes these markers in his narrative of the Persian Wars, presenting a retrospective and idealized notion of the Hellene that had not yet fully materialized in the archaic consciousness. In his histories, Herodotus codifies a form of self-recognition among Greeks, framed primarily through their opposition to the culturally and politically distinct Persians.
Right. Yeah. I mentioned that on the rise of Alexander the Great, he was the one that formally united all of Greece, but even back then, as the Persians kept moving on and on towards Greece, and the people of Greece started recognizing that, some of the higher-ups, like Herodotus and others, knew that in order for them to survive as a people, they knew that they had to unite regardless of what city they came from. I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, I just really want to make sure that I'm being transformative once again.
This portrayal is thus both descriptive and prescriptive. It articulates a self-image while also promoting it. Herodotus' conception of Hellenism is deeply shared by the Athenian intellectual milieu in which he was situated.
There's something I can add on to. Yeah, most of what we know as quintessentially ancient Greek really just refers to the culture of Athens. Like, democracy, at least in its early stages, originated specifically in Athens. And Athenian democracy was a direct democracy where the people themselves would come together in order to vote on issues. Granted, it was mostly adult male citizens that were allowed to vote. If you were a kid or a woman, or you were from outside the city, then you weren't allowed to vote within elections and stuff. Sparta, on the other hand, had I guess we could call it a duarchy. It's either biarchy or duarchy. They had two kings, basically. And this goes back to a founding story. I don't remember the story. I just know that that Sparta was ruled by two kings, which I guess we can call it's either biarchy, diarchy, or duarchy. I don't really remember. But going back to Athens specifically in democracy, it's obviously not the same as modern democracy, which is a representative one, where we vote for other people to speak on behalf of us. Although, if you know anything about modern politics, you know that the people that we vote for don't necessarily have our best interests at heart.
He elevated notions such as liberty and self-governance, values associated with democratic Athens, as quintessentially Hellenic, implicitly contrasting them with the perceived despotism of the Persian regime. Through a narrative technique that defies the Greek by what he's not, Herodotus constructs an identity matrix rooted in contrast and cultural perceived superiority. In a notable episode from Book 8, Herodotus synthesizes elements of kinship, shared religious observance, and linguistic commonality with shared societal customs. This can be a form to articulate the early template for Greek ethnicity.
Yeah, one of the things that I had mentioned before that the Greeks had in common, yeah, not only did they more or less speak the same language and worship the same gods, they also participated in the same Olympics. So they had a lot of things in common with each other, despite the fact that they were more aligned to their cities and regions than they were to Greece as a whole.
While it would be anachronistic to claim the existence of a formal pan-Hellenic identity during the Archaic period, since extant documentary evidence does not attest such self-conception at the time, the elements that later coalesced into a coherent ethnic identity are already fully perceptible. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out this content.
Don't
and at the
worry.
same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.
Sorry. Threads of Hellenism. Is this where we're going to get into the threat of the Persians and the rise of Alexander?
The emergence of a unified Hellenic identity was not a sudden occurrence, but rather the result of a millennium-long evolution, culminating in a construct that bears little resemblance to the fragmented realities of early Greek societies. The term ancient Greek itself is frequently misapplied, suggesting a degree of unity among the diverse communities scattered across the Aegean.
Yeah, I mentioned this a little bit ago, where what most people think of as ancient Greece, they're really just thinking of ancient Athens. Like, even ancient Greek, the ancient Greek language, or rather classical Greek, was actually classical Attic, meaning it's the dialect and variety of Greek that was spoken in and around Athens. There was no unified Greek language, but a series of regional dialects that spanned across not only the peninsula, but the islands of the Aegean.
Not in fact exist in any fixed or absolute form. The various ethni, developed along divergent cultural and political lines, coming together only sporadically and often under exceptional circumstances, are the truer image. Despite the apparent stasis of the preceding centuries, the socio-political landscape of early Iron Age Greece underwent a rapid transformation with the advent of the polis. The establishment of autonomous city-states afforded communities a space to cultivate unique identities. In time, these discrete developments would give rise to mutual recognition, a realization of shared trajectories that seeded the growth of a broader Hellenic image. By the dawn of the 8th century BC, Greece was emerging from a prolonged period of demographic and cultural regression. The term Hellas, denoting both the geographical expanse and the cultural shape encompassing the southern Balkan Peninsula and adjacent Aegean coastline, housed numerous groups whose internal perceptions mirrored the region's fragmented terrain. Rugged mountains, isolated populations, and coastal dispersion fostered maritime dependency. These conditions encouraged a maritime orientation, making seafaring and access to trade routes key determinants of regional power and prestige.
Right. The sea is a pretty big part of, like, the Greek identity. You take a look at Greece itself. Yeah, you would think that you would think that mainland Greece is too large, or it's like the peninsula and then a large island. No, it's one peninsula that's connected by a narrow isthmus that you saw earlier in the video, the type of geology and rock formations that make it very difficult for the city-states to really claim land, which is why a lot of them were so separate to begin with, because of its rugged geography. I mean, it's basically sits right north of the plate boundary between Africa and Eurasia, and kind of sits on a microplate of its own. I think it's the Aegean plate. I might have to double check on the plate tectonics of Greece, but yeah, all the islands, the result of the geography of Greece is the result of tectonic activity, which, shocker.
Over time, this gave rise to maritime civilizations that came to include the many Aegean islands within the expanding orbit of Hellenic culture and influence. Preceding the Archaic period, however, much of this same geographic area had been dominated by the Mycenaean civilization, an expansive and
Yeah, you could see right here, this isthmus is what connects this part. I believe it's called the... I don't remember what this peninsula is called. I think it's the Peloponnese, or maybe I'm thinking of something else.
sophisticated society that experienced an abrupt population collapse. This decline precipitated the onset of the so-called Dark Age, from which Greece would only emerge in the 8th century. Archaeological evidence, particularly funerary remains, reflect this dramatic demographic shift. Anthony Snodgrass, through grave analysis, identified a substantial increase in burials between 950 and 700 BC, suggesting a population explosion that played a catalytic role in societal regeneration. This demographic rebound did not in isolation inaugurate the Archaic Age, but it fostered environmental and societal conditions conducive to its emergence. The absence of contemporary literary sources aside from epic traditions attributed to Homer and Hesiod renders this period opaque. Nevertheless, material remains such as burial feasts and botanical analyses, such as pollen counts, provide precious insight into subsistent patterns. Evidence suggests a decline in arable agriculture across the 11th to the 9th century BC, consistent with a pastoral economy. By contrast, the early Archaic period sees the reintroduction of crop cultivation, indicating increasing sedentism and the re-establishment of permanent settlements.
Convergence. Is it okay? Is this where we're going to talk about how they all united? I expected it to have already. I already expected him to touch upon it, but let's see if this is where he touches upon it.
These agrarian communities gradually developed interconnectivity, facilitating the circulation of practices and ideas. The recovery of arable farming and the ensuing settlement continuity created the preconditions for cultural exchange and eventually the rise of city-state-based civilization. The city-state became the dominant organization unit of ancient Hellas, a political, economic, and religious nucleus surrounded by territory subject to its authority. Civic loyalty and identification with one's polis became central to individual identity and precursor to the collective one. Paradoxically, while the polis reinforced localism, it also provided the framework through which Pan-Hellenic consciousness could emerge. As cities matured in relative isolation, they began to recognize resonant values and practices in neighboring communities, generating a sense of shared heritage. This in turn led to an increasing preoccupation with questions of ethnicity and collective belonging. In a sense, ethnic identity may be seen as one modality within a broader matrix of common identity, denoting perceived bonds of connection and mutual recognition, shared territory, tradition, language, descent, but above all, a sense of peoplehood. Jeremy McInerney argues a sense of ethnicity is meaningless without processes of inclusion and exclusion. Yet, long before Hellenes faced a major foreign other, ethnic consciousness developed primarily through what Jonathan M. Hall describes as the aggregative mode. The core of the thesis lying within the concept of mythopoetic tradition.
It's one of those, I guess we can call it an unfortunate reality. It's like, here in the modern day, we're all about diversity and inclusiveness. But back then, the whole concept of like being part of a group means that your people are different from those people, and you're vying for control and fighting with each other over like land disputes among other things. But regardless, it's one of those unfortunate facets. I don't know what else to add on to it, but that's just how it is. And that's how it's always been, even to this day.
This ancestral genealogy will be the basis of how the word Hellene will be interwoven, first ground up and solidified through Book 8 of Herodotus' History.
Plutarch and Herodotus.
To conclude our discussion, a comprehensive assessment of Herodotus' historiographical legacy in antiquity can be elevated through Plutarch's critical reception of his works. A distinguished philosopher, historian, and moralist of the early imperial period, in his polemical treatise De Herodoti Malignitate, on the malice of Herodotus, Plutarch offers us...
Malice of Herodotus? Did Herodotus do something? Did he do something naughty or something? Or am I just misinterpreting?
Scathing indictment of what he perceives as Herodotus' tenditious narrative strategies and ideological partiality. Central to Plutarch's objection is the claim that Herodotus exhibits a discernible pro-Athenian bias.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah. Once again, when we think of ancient Greece, what we really think of is ancient Athens.
Which manifests in the unjust vilification of other Greek poleis, most notably Thebes and Corinth. In Plutarch's view, Herodotus' historiographical lens privileges the Athenian polis at the expense of a more equitable portrayal of the broader Hellenic world. A particularly illustrative example of this perceived partiality is Herodotus' account of the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Thebans are depicted as reluctant participants, allegedly held under duress by the Spartans. Yet it is important to recognize that Plutarch's critique, while influential, was not universally accepted in antiquity. Other notable intellectuals of the time, such as Theopompus, Aristarchus, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Lucian, expressed admiration for Herodotus' prose, narrative skill, and ethnographic scope. And with this, we conclude today's analysis. I hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into how the Greek people became one. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings.
Alright, thanks Metatron for the nice video. I was hoping he would get into the Indo-European aspect, like the migrations out of the Pontic steppes north of the Caucasus Mountains, but I guess that would have required a whole lot more research, since we still don't really know how it happened. I mean, we have when it comes to the Indo-European migrations, we have very little records about how it happened. I mean, the peoples later in history that we know are Indo-European make very little mention of any migrations out of the steppes. We only know that they came out of the steppes just based on a lot of archaeological and genetic evidence with the evolution of pottery and stuff. Different cultures have different pottery styles, and those pottery styles can change depending on who's living there, or whether or not the local culture decided, hey, how about instead of this style, we do it this way instead. But regardless, this is just I guess we can call it another filler video. I'm still waiting to get my 3D model in so that I can work on the big video that I really want to make. Yeah, I've been meaning to react to this for a while, but I never got around to it because I had other things to make. So this one's been in the works for some time, but hopefully you guys enjoyed this little reaction, and I hope you guys found it as informative as I did. And be sure to check out Metatron and his channel, and do the same thing for me, and I hope to see you guys in another reaction.